on today's episode of Life Embodied.
Let's take a concrete example, a 2-year-old. Great emotional expression, terrible emotional regulation. Okay, so the liberals are right. That's the sort of emotional expressive, the liberal crying in the embodiment workshop. The person who, quits work because they're a little bit tired and doesn't do the interview they said they were going to do, But then the conservative's also right when he says, well, we need to discipline ourselves. We need to honor our word. We need to do hard things, have the cold showers, lift the weights. And then they both carry wisdom. They both carry wisdom in the same way as a 2-year-old has got great emotional expression that me and you can only be jealous of. But I think if anyone had had a tantrum when they couldn't get a chocolate bar that they wanted in the supermarket, like a 2-year-old would find that a bit immature, right?
For sure.
So for me, the integration of kind of liberal and conservative worldviews is really necessary for a kind of mature embodied practice.
Welcome to Life Embodied, where we explore how an embodiment practice can support us in meeting the challenges of life. How can we surf the waves of life deeply anchored in the safety of our bodies? How can we learn to trust our capacity to be with intense sensations and emotions? How can we cultivate body awareness, and why does it matter? Episodes include interviews with experts and practitioners that bring their knowledge and passion and share practical tips for your everyday life. I am your host, Katharina Alf. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the conversation. My guest today, I am so thrilled, is Mark Walsh, aka Mr. Embodiment. Born and raised in the UK, he is currently located in Brighton, but regularly travels the world. Mark is a teacher for embodiment and has worked in many countries and contexts, including teaching centering tools to CEOs and bringing trauma first aid to war zones. Mark is the founder of Embodiment Unlimited and has brought to life the Embodiment Conference in 2018 and 2021. He is also an author, podcast host, and Aikido black belt. Welcome, Mark. Thanks for doing this.
Pleasure. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, we just recently met in person for the first time, right?
Yeah, it was fun in Berlin, right? It's a fun workshop.
Yeah.
I definitely remembered you there. Yeah, good vibe.
Yeah, it was really nice to finally meet you in person after, being to many online events and stuff. And yeah, but I'll talk a little bit more about this later because I want to start with the question, what is it like being you, being your body? What is the experience? Maybe in general, maybe just today, like what's it like being you?
It's like a train full of clowns that is crashing into Romeo and Juliet being played at the Globe while there's thunder and lightning happening. And your mum just died, but she was kind of old and, you're sad, but it's okay. And, you're holding your best friend's hand. That's what it's like being me.
Oh, wow. That sounds intense and weirdly sexy.
I'll take that from you. I mean, today I'm just a bit tired, be a bit less pretentious and more mundane. I'm a little tired, but in a good way, like tired from a life of purpose, tired from, mostly my work, and purpose is energizing, but eventually it still gets tiring on a human level. So I've got a couple of light things to do today, like chat with you, which is kind of a nice thing to do, and a few other things. So today sort of happily tired.
Anything specific that you do on a day like that? Because I definitely know the feeling. How do you navigate these tired days?
Yeah. It's very interesting, isn't it, that as adults, we need to have a balance or kind of dance between discipline, willpower, commitment, integrity, honoring one's word. That's the sort of, on the right-hand side, kind of Nietzsche kind of vibe. And then on the other side, we've got, more like the embodiment side, actually feeling into our body and, okay, do I want to go with the flow? Do I want to cancel something? Do I want to take it easy? And that's always a dance, right? Because if we just do what exactly we've got planned and what we've said, we'll brutalize ourselves. But equally, if we just go with the flow, as the hippies like to say, what they mean by that is give in to their cravings and desires and fears, then you're gonna not get anything done and not be trustable, because you'll always break your word whenever you feel like it, right? So this is one of those unresolvable things in life that we have to flow between those two things. You have to figure out, okay, is it just a matter of just getting on with it today? That's a good skill to have, and as adults we need that, right? Do I need to raise my mood? Do I need to listen to some music? Do I need to go for a walk? Do I need to change my meditation practice in the morning? Do I need to skip my meditation practice? Do I need to have a cold shower to wake myself up? Do I need to just rest really well? Do I need to make sure I just get I just ate a really good steak for lunch, and I had 20 minutes just lying on the couch because I knew I had an interview coming up, and I thought, I don't want to be completely wasted for this interview, so I'm going to eat well and rest well, and not just be on my phone and emailing in the background kind of thing. So there's a few answers there.
Oh yeah, for sure. Thanks. I want to come back to what it was like to meet you in person, because in the last years, I don't know, I mainly encountered you like in this one-way direction in your Facebook presence.
Parasocial relationship.
Yeah. Exactly. The thing is, what I wasn't entirely sure about before meeting you is that when I met you and experienced you teaching, is you're very kind. You have a lot of empathy for your students. You have absolutely impeccable boundaries. Like, this is what I experienced. I felt very, very safe in your presence. And this is something I wasn't necessarily sure about before.
People are like, oh, you're not an asshole. That's a nice surprise.
But do you get why one might get the impression that it's not necessarily safe to be around you when they've only know you from Facebook?
No, but I'm not safe. I'm definitely not safe. You don't want to be around safe men. You want to be around appropriately dangerously men. You're like, what are you talking about? Like, of course I'm not safe.
I mean that you don't cross the boundaries of your students. You're very aware that they might agree to stuff that just because they're trying to be like nice, and then they say like, yeah, of course it's fine, but you're like, I don't think it's fine, so let's take a step back. And this is what I mean by safe as a leader, as a teacher.
I mean, I'm ethical, right? Like, I don't fuck my students. Right? It could just be, some basic stuff. And I'm pretty consent conscious, and I can tune in to my students and sort of see maybe if they're pushing themselves too hard, and I care about their well-being, right? Like, I'm basically a kind person. Somehow people think there's a contradiction between being kind and ethical and, sometimes saying things people disagree with. I mean, that's what, when people say provocative, that's what they really mean, right? It's like, you sometimes say things some people get upset by. Fine. We all have values, right? And our values are not what we say, they're what we do. And all of us love truth to some extent. Some people just love avoiding conflict more than they love truth, or they love getting paid the most they can to truth, or they love not being attacked on Twitter or whatever more than they love truth. Mm-hmm. I just like truth more than most people. I mean, I'm a teacher, right? So it's like, that's just a more important value to me than, like, I don't know, let's say like 20% of Berlin embodiment crowd hates me. Like, that's not nice for me, right? But twisting myself out of shape and being silent about things I think are important is way worse for me. It's way worse. Like, I would rather all the blue-haired Berlin feminists love me. That would be a much more chill world, okay? But if I upset some of them, that's okay too. So, like, you're not pizza. Not everyone loves you.
Yeah. Thanks for embodying those values. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it too. And I kind of wish more of us would kind of make a stand, because a lot of people tell me things quietly. People whisper in my ear. I am ironically a safe space for certain people, right? Teachers whisper in my ear, I say, "This is all bullshit. What's going on?" Some of the things around different topics, they whisper and say, they because I know them all, right? Because of the conferences we do and things like that. And they go, "I wish I could be as honest as you." I'm like, yeah, if you were as honest as me, your list would be half the size, but you wouldn't hate your own students. I've got friends that have got big ass lists, they've got big businesses, but they're scared of their students. And I'm like, I like my students. I just spent 3 days with my mentees, right? Just 3 awesome days of hanging out and eating together and hugging. Some of my mentees came around my house at 7:30 this morning to meditate, and I'm seeing one at 9 p.m. tonight to go to the gym with her. Like, I don't mind seeing them first thing in the morning or late at night because they're cool and we get on. I don't have to hide anything from them, and it's honest. And it's if I didn't speak the truth, not my truth, then I wouldn't be able to do that. It'd be exhausting.
Yeah. Who modeled leadership that way to you?
That's a great question. I mean, I've had some courageous teachers. Paul Linden's been my main teacher in the sort of trauma world. And there's this sort of cultural tradition. So several of my teachers are Jewish and my family are Irish, and they're both some don't give a fuck cultures. Like, it's part of Irishness to just be like, here's an example. In Ireland in the past, if you changed your name and became Protestant, the British would feed you so you and your family wouldn't starve to death. And this was called taking the soup. So the British would say, like, here's some soup, and if you eat this and become Protestant and you change your name to signify that, you will survive or have a better chance of surviving. And this is a few hundred years ago. And to this day, people, when they meet you, will ask your surname. And if it's one of the changed ones, they'll say, "My family didn't take the soup like yours." And people would rather die than take the soup, right? So it's like, and we're not dealing with that kind of issue, right? And obviously the Jews have had their experience. I need to tell you that. So I think there's a cultural context. It's also coming from youth. I had a lot of shame in my youth due to my dad's alcoholism and being in a small village. And there was a certain part of me that just went, oh, people are going to talk shit, whatever. And it is painful. It is painful. I was on a meditation retreat recently, and I found out afterwards there was a bunch of people there that thought I was a racist because of some awful takedown articles that were written years ago that were just complete nonsense. And that's not nice for me. It's not nice for me to hear that. I think unless you're actually like a full sociopath, it's not fun being disliked. But I'd rather like myself and be disliked by other people. That's a nice quote. I'm putting that on Facebook later.
Yeah. And I mean, your mission is really to like as I perceive it, is to bring embodiment to the broad public. Like really, like to take it out of the hippie corner, out of the new age corner, and bring it to basically everybody who cares.
Yeah, I mean, bringing embodiment to the world is definitely my life's work. And it doesn't just mean, me as an embodiment teacher. I love to host other teachers and have co-teachers. And, we do have conferences and events. And, my podcast has 500 episodes. And I think maybe 15 of them are me talking. The other, let's do some maths, 485 are guests, mostly. I'm talking, it's mostly them. So, I'm very interested in bringing embodiment as a field to everyone who wants it. That's things like the conference and the podcast. But then my personal training isn't for everyone, and it's I think it's really in the same way as like I wouldn't sleep with everyone, right? Like there are some really attractive men in Berlin who I'm never going to sleep with. Okay, Florian, if you're out there, stop hassling me. So it doesn't matter how nice they are; they're just not a good fit with me as a straight guy, right? So they're cool guys, but I'm not into them. So it's the same with your work. Your personal work will never be a good fit for everyone. And the sooner you make peace with that, the happier you'll be, the better clients you'll have. You'll make plenty of money within your own niche without trying to be all things to all people. A hairdresser doesn't say, well, I'm a hairdresser, but I'm also a butcher's, right? That would be a gross hairdresser and a bad butcher's. So it's kind of like you need to know your niche. So that's also part of what I do, is really loving this particular. Because if you want like a new age Californian embodiment teacher or a woke Berlin embodiment teacher, you can find that. And there's some good ones. I could even recommend one for you. I know some really nice Berliners and some really nice Californians who I love to bits. Some of them don't love me back, but I think they do great work. And I could recommend them to you. So I think it's really important that we know our flavor. Brand would be the corporate term, but it's more like it's like, who do you fall in love with? You're not everyone's cup of tea. And then, my wider work, the company's work, is just making embodiment much more accessible, because it's really in a little strange little cul-de-sac if it's just kind of counterculture that can deal with it. I've seen that happen with mindfulness. Like mindfulness, my sister meditates, my niece meditates. Like mindfulness has gone mainstream, and that's brilliant. Or else my sister's from a small town in rural England, and there's no way that they would have some hippie Buddhists in the school. That it's only because it's gone mainstream that my niece and my sister have any access to that. So there's risks in that too, and I'm not without caution as one of the popularizers of modern embodiment, much older than me as a movement, of course, but as one of the popularizers of it. There's some caution there, but mostly just happiness that there's so many options for people.
I've been recently digging a little bit into John Vervaeke's work. I don't know.
It's great. Yeah.
And he talks about that in the ancient times, we had like this as if almost not fully awake state of being, of like a cyclical perspective onto life. And then at some point we discovered like progress and forward action.
Yeah.
Whole idea of transcendence came, and as if like to overcome our physical, like the physical world, and go into the higher self or something like that. And I think that in a way we're kind of at a tipping point where it's like, okay, this doesn't make sense. We need to get back down here. Like, let's get back to the real world, and that this is kind of the whole embodiment thing, right? To remember, like, we do have a body, and it's not a foul thing. It's not a sinful thing. It's actually everything we have. And the only thing that is real for sure. And
I feel, therefore I am.
Exactly. I feel, therefore I am. And what is your take on this? Or what do you think? Where are we headed with this?
Okay, there's loads. I can jam on this for a while if you don't mind. There's some great. That's a great setup. I mean, John Vervaeke's work on ways of knowing is a fantastic introduction to why we need embodiment. In that, it's not just knowing about things. Yeah. So we've also got skills knowing. What cognitive scientists call procedural learning. It's very different than knowing about something. To knowing how to do. Like, I can know about Germany, but do I know Germany? Right? Can I speak German? No. Right. These are different types of knowing. And then just a knowing of immersion. You learn martial arts by being in a dojo as much as you learn from the skills. So there's the immersive element to it, the relational element. We learn from teachers. We learn in relationships. My cheeky humor comes through my cultural background and my Jewish teachers as much as it is mine. Right. So these are all with us. So his ways of knowing is great. He does this wonderful mapping of the history of philosophy, which is not this abstract thing, because it's how we live, actually, because we're all living implicit philosophies unless we study them explicitly. So like social justice, for example, is, carrying on all these Christian evangelical kind of traditions that are nothing to do with what it purports to be about, plus these Marxist traditions that we might want to be a bit cautious of too in that movement. So it's important to know these kind of traditions and the assumptions. And a big one, we could say, what's disembodying? Well, there has been this movement from the Greeks, certain Greeks, though not all Greeks. My colleague Virginia from Athens, who I was having coffee with this morning, might be keen to say that certain Greeks kind of had this idea that spirit was holy and body was sinful, right? It was somehow bad. It was somehow lesser. Though not all Greeks, because there's a whole Semitic movement in Greece. And that, in this idea of sort of technological process, getting away from nature, getting away from body. It has kind of an anti-women element to it as well. Women are blood and childbirth and breastfeeding, and that's bad somehow. Men are cognitive and abstract, and that's good. So there's a few elements to it, and this idea of progress, which it's very interesting, because this idea of we leave things in the past, and that's something we leave behind. We transcend and exclude. And for example, that was part of the kind of domination, imperialist kind of narrative. It'd be like, German or the English or the French imperialists saying, well, we're progressing and these natives are primitive, right? But then the same narrative is unconsciously mostly in the far left. So they even talk about being a progressive in America. That's what we would call being left wing in Europe, or being a liberal, they talk about as well, right? So but being progressive, and this idea that we always have to get more liberal. Okay, so it's like, where's the limits of that? Like, so there's certain things like, great, like gay marriage is a thing now, and it wasn't. And I really support that, and I think that's a beautiful thing, and I'm glad my gay friends can get married. But if that's progress, what's the next thing? And the next thing? And there's this idea that moral superiority comes from this sort of increasing movement away from nature, right? So there's a lot in that people need to really think about and go, am I getting swept along with a sort of 500-year or 2,000-year philosophical current that's making me believe a certain thing, rather than actually going myself? And then in the modern context, of course, you've got a kind of technology and the promise of transhumanism, that we'll all download ourselves to the cloud, and our bodies don't really matter. So our biological sex is completely irrelevant, right? And this is almost normal amongst young people, certainly in the West, not in Eastern Europe or China or Africa or South America even, but certainly in the small, ridiculously extreme cultural context that is North America and Western Europe, which is very extreme. If you study history, it's very unusual in a good and bad ways. And that idea that the body is just simply irrelevant, like, that's fascinating to me. And as an embodiment teacher, I always say, well, the body is really relevant. And that doesn't mean we can't express ourselves in different ways, or dress how we want, or love who we want. Of course, if anyone's listening to this isn't a takedown attempt. But certainly the body matters. And it's not just that we can't download ourselves to a computer, because the body is such a part of ourselves. How would we download that? We're not just information. We're much more than information. So it's impossible to download yourself. There's just a few random thoughts. I don't know if you want to pick up on any of that. It's a big topic.
Yeah, I think it's a bit a question of what comes next. Like after the transcendence away from the body and from the foul flesh, and then we come back to our flesh and to our body, and we realize it's actually a nice place to be there, and it's the only place to be. But we don't at the same time return to ancient times or ancient philosophy, right? Yeah. It's more like
and that's if I can jump in, is that's another trend in embodiment, is the return to goodness.
Yeah, return to the Stone Age.
Right, like we're all going to become tribal people, even though we don't have ringworm, and you'd be dead of childbirth by now after having had 7 children, and like massive murder rates in a lot of these tribal societies. A lot of Native Americans used to practice ritualistic torture of their enemies. Child abuse was ritualized in a bunch of these societies. Just terrible things. Yet there's this very romantic, I say that in a philosophical sense, as well as the more commonsensical understanding of the word, notion that we should sort of return to goodness. We should have this idealized view of, if you see hippies doing embodiment retreats in Portugal, that's definitely part of their implicit philosophy. Conservatives have the other point of view, which is that human nature is sort of fallible, and we have instincts that aren't always great, and we might want to kind of restrain ourselves a little bit. And they're both right. Obviously, we have some. Like let's take a concrete example: a 2-year-old, great emotional expression, terrible emotional regulation. Okay, so the liberals are right. That's the sort of emotional expressive, the liberal crying in the embodiment workshop, the person who quits work because they're a little bit tired and doesn't do the interview they said they were going to do. But then the conservatives also right when he says, well, we need to discipline ourselves. We need to kind of have some honor our word. We need to do hard things. We need to get better at, have the cold showers, lift the weights. That's a movement in embodiment too, right? Like cold showers and tough yoga, extreme yoga, hot yoga. And then they both carry wisdom. They both carry wisdom in the same way as a 2-year-old has got great emotional expression that me and you can only be jealous of, how fluid they are in their emotional expression, for example. But I think if anyone had had a tantrum when they couldn't get a chocolate bar that they wanted in the supermarket, like a 2-year-old would find that a bit immature, right?
For sure.
So for me, the integration of these kind of worldviews is really the integration of kind of liberal and conservative worldviews is really necessary for a kind of mature embodied practice. I'd say kind of taking the best of certain things without taking the worst. As you say, we can't go back in time, which is both conservatives want to do that as well. Make America great again. Well, you don't see make Germany great again hats, do you? Because people don't want to go there, right? And in Britain, if you've read your history books, you might also have a lot of shame and guilt and this kind of thing. But there are wonderful, noble things in German history that we might want to actually encourage. You have a very rich philosophical tradition, for example. And Britain has many things to be proud of. Britain ended the slave trade internationally. It ended it. People, Britain's full of slavers and it was this terrible colonial country. It's like, we ended the slave trade, the first culture in human history. The Chinese, the Indians, the Aztecs, they all had slavery. There was only one that ended it. So I think it was Denmark was the first country to outlaw it, and then Britain enforced that ban a few years later. So, this is a unique achievement of a Western country. And, equally, if I was French, I'd be saying wonderful things about France, or Spanish or Italian. Good to be proud of who you are and where you're from. Japanese, equally. So I think the integration, not going back, but equally not having this sort of blind idea that progressive always means more and more like the 2-year-old or more and more disembodied. More and more away from the actual physical reality of being human, a kind of transhumanist idea. So that's why you go back to our theme of Facebook, right? Facebook can just be really unpleasant. You can get a really weird idea of someone. And I don't know about you, but if I spend an hour on Facebook, I don't feel good. Mm-hmm. Do you feel good? I don't feel good. No. My body, I might use it for my work. It's nice to stay in contact with you. It's nice to see you've been doing this podcast. I think I left an encouraging comment, and it's sometimes it can be nice, but the basic medium is less inclined to love than face to face.
Yeah,
it's less inclined to wisdom too. Actually, the medium isn't the message, but the medium definitely impacts the message. And face to face, people are okay, aren't they? Most people are all right when you're actually in a room with them, hanging out, having a kebab. They're all right, Online, everyone seems so angry and so polarized, but in that workshop, in person, people are cool.
Yeah, and you probably will find something you have in common with anybody, right?
Well, there's always death.
There's always death. Yeah, I just read this in your book that you say this is nice to establish equality in the beginning of a workshop.
A great equalizer. It's a great equalizer, the rich man, the poor man, the famous, the infamous, whatever, and death. We're all a bag of bones.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you say integrating the conservative and the liberal, or the progress and conservatism.
Yeah, tendencies towards expression and regulation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you think of embodied practice, it all starts with awareness, and then we can either change it or we can go with it, right? Mm-hmm. So they're kind of two sides of embodied practice.
Yeah.
So if I'm tired, I can wake myself up, or I can go to sleep.
Yeah.
Both are valid.
Yeah. 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 Wow. It's really it seems to be such an important challenge, right? To be to really find capacity to hold ambivalence or to balance out, and as if to bridge these two extremes in a way, in ourselves, in our societies, in the world.
Yeah, and embodied practice is just a great way to do that practically, right? Like I was at conscious dance at the weekend. You go with the flow, you scream and shout, you let it all out, you feel what wants to happen, cry if you want to cry. But equally, I do my weightlifting and my cold showers. I do this stuff which is like, no, this is difficult. You ever feel like having a cold shower in the morning? I don't know. Maybe there's some psychotic person who does, but this is a discipline. So to me, these are both beautiful sides of embodied practice. People tend to lean into their neurotic tendencies and political conditioning.
Yeah.
Which is a mistake, because you'll get more and more one-sided. In case that wasn't obvious.
There's one thing that I wanted to address, because I've just read your book. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. Brought me to tears several times. Really touched me. Especially your personal stories. And one thing that touched me, and you write in the chapter that this is something you don't talk about so often.
Some might not.
And I was like, all right, let's talk about it.
Yeah. I'm gonna play that scam. What deepest trauma are you about to unearth?
No big trauma. Like, it's a very, very beautiful thought. I think it's when you talk about how embodiment is actually a way to experience interconnectedness and oneness with the world and with others, and that in a way you in your own body have experienced so many different things that might not even have happened to you individually, but that you kind of empathized with, or that you felt in your surroundings or felt in other people. And through this, they kind of became part of you.
Yeah, so there's what I teach. But when I do a coaching course, for example, we train embodiment coaches, and it's very concrete, it's very practical, it's very concrete, and it's all stuff that I go, you know what, I'm pretty sure this is the case. It's good never to be certain, but there's often a really like, hey, I've tried and tested this over the years. And that's the realm of what one claims kind of expertise in, like, hey, I've got the relevant training and experience. And then there's another side of embodiment, which is the sort of realm of the mystical, the realm of the poetic. My favorite podcast on this side of embodiment is called The Emerald, and is just one of the best podcasts, if not the best podcast I've ever heard. It puts me to shame as a podcaster.
I listened to it and I was like, oh, wow, you're allowed to do that. I might have to really rethink my whole concept.
It's really next level. I mean, interviews are great, but he does something. But yeah, it's also the amount of time you want to spend on it. Do you know what I mean? But it's beautiful. It's art. So the best way to speak around this sort of mysterious side of the body, I think, is often poetry and art and music and dancing with fabulous women. It's not necessarily logically kind of elucidating it, laying it out. It's like dancing about architecture. The best way to elucidate architecture is not to dance, it's to make a nice diagram on a piece of paper. Does that make sense? So it's like the opposite of that. So to make nice diagrams on a piece of paper or on a podcast with words about that side of embodiment is always going to be crude at best and potentially misleading. Though let's try, because it's fun.
Yay.
I mean, because it's sort of like, we just got to sort of, it's almost like a disclaimer. It's like, not that I'm embarrassed people will think I'm weird or something, because everyone knows I'm weird. I'm from a family of schizophrenics and mystics, religious. My mum was a nun, it's not embarrassing, but it is. I think I'm not known for my humility, but we should have a humility about what we claim is true, if we're going to claim it. If you love truth, that humility is necessary. So for me, it's more like poetry, or like the suggestive way of saying the body seems to open up into worlds. There seems to be a transpersonal element to the body. And again, if someone says, yes, that's true because quantum physics, they should shut the fuck up, because you can't be certain about this stuff. That's the point. but there's a way in which there's a sort of empathy, which is more than just, well, I see someone and I have mirror neurons, I'm relatively well socialized and not a psychopath, right? There's that empathy. But then there's also just a sense of we contain worlds. And we are seeing some evidence for things like intergenerational trauma, though I'd also add intergenerational resilience. But actually, everyone is your ancestor. Well, not everyone's your direct ancestor, but you are related to everyone, right? So if twins or brothers and sisters can pick things up from each other, why not a bit more than that? And there's definitely experiences I've had through the body, which are essentially oceanic experiences or transpersonal experiences. I mean, the body's always been a very valid way in to those kind of things. Equally, dissociating from the body has been, though, as well. The sort of mystical flight experiences and this kind of thing. So they're both ways in. Maybe that's enough.
Yeah. I mean, you're right in a way. It will always be a bit weird to talk about it since it's so subjective, right? It's so much in a specific situation, the experience of an individual person, and yet again, I think many people can relate to this experience. Like I'm really. I feel like the last 5 years I really spent deep in these communities where where it's a lot about the poetic side of embodiment, and really like using embodiment practice also to connect to the bigger picture, to connect to other people, to connect to the world in a very felt sense.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the connection, if you're connected to self, it's easier to empathize and connect to others. If you're, we have eco-regulation, co-regulation. I sometimes talk about theo-regulation, these ways in which we're connected to, these are all things that are helpful for each other. The more connected to spirit you are, the more easy it is to connect to other people. The more connected to other people you are, it's, adds something to being in nature. Think of having a picnic with a lover in the woods, right? Like, is it self-regulation, eco-regulation, co-regulation? They're all bouncing off each other to create a kind of wonderful experience, right? And that you could describe as a spiritual experience. And certainly the body creates altered states. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I could have an altered state with a very short amount of breath work, or, I have a profound altered state every time I do a yoga class now, because the more you get access to altered states, the easier they are to access in future. I can do a hour-long hatha yoga class and be tripping my tits off. That's a technical term from England, if anyone's out there listening. So, it's sort of dancers who regularly enter into ecstatic states dancing. I mean, even sports people, I saw one study, and it was saying like 80% of NFL players, that's American football players, have had a transcendent spiritual experience playing American football. Like, it's a really high amount. Like, it was I forget the exact percentage. It was over 50. And these are not people you would regard necessarily as a bunch of hippies. And this study was done in the 70s or 80s. So it was before mindfulness kind of hit the mainstream, right? Just because they're doing extreme things. I'm going to the gym later, and I tell you, you're around serious bodybuilders. I used to go to a very serious bodybuilding gym in Madeira. It's like a Portuguese champion just happened to open this gym that was the nearest gym to my house. And those guys are having a religious experience. Like when you fall to your knees in the squat rack, having done your personal best ever squat, and you really go through a near-death experience when you do something like that. And you're just, you're racked by pain, and you're using every bit of energy, mental, physical, spiritual in your body to lift that weight. And then afterwards you fall to your knees and you're crying in a pool of your own sweat. I mean, that is a religious experience. And like these you don't have to have a sort of be a spiritual outlook or have dreadlocks or something.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I've just recently been thinking about, because you talk about like falling to the floor in your sweat and tears, and I've recently been thinking about that, that I would so appreciate like a modern time temple where you could like lie naked on the stone and cry and beg for mercy, And then a friend said, "You have this in gay sauna."
Gay sauna. There you go. You go to the gay sauna. Yeah. Go to Bali. But yeah. Bali's a bit civilized, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah,
there's sort of
probably no screaming there, but yeah.
there's definitely places for it. And you do see that, every five rhythms class, people are seeking the mystical. There's no doubt about it, right? And some
Mm.
explicitly, some it's just implicitly. People are seeking ritual. Like you go to a yoga class, everyone does their sun salutations together. I mean, there's some human urge for that. There's some human urge for that.
Yeah.
And we'll keep trying to find it in these slightly, commercialized yoga studios and things like that. But at the same time, denying our own heritage. It's I had an Indian friend of mine. It's actually a colleague. He's my web guy. And he came to visit from Delhi. We had a meeting here, and we were walking through town. We went by the church, just a normal little English village church. Actually, in the west of England now, not Brighton. And he said, "Oh, can we go in?" And he was really excited because he'd never been in a church before. Now he's been around, Varanasi and Taj Mahal, all these, Indian stuff. He's a Hindu, standard Indian dude, tech guy, but he's got Indian heritage. And he was so excited, and he was never seen stained glass windows before. He said they were beautiful,
Wow.
you know.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to see someone kind of think it was exotic, the things that I grew up with, and how we discount those things. And then I fed him beans on toast, obviously, as some good English food, which he wasn't so keen on, but that's fair enough.
Yeah. You even write this in your book. Like I just checked for the quote because I really liked it. Is that there is power in ritual, and to go against it is a crime.
Yeah, it really is. So, like, I think this experience came from I'd been dating my wife for a couple of years before we got married. And then we got
Mhm.
married because of a visa situation. She wasn't able to come back from honeymoon with me back to the UK because the visa hadn't come through. And it actually didn't come through
Mhm.
for a year in the end. And that was
Oof.
very painful. It
Mhm.
was very painful because we've been sort of ritualistically bonded in a marriage,
Mhm.
and had a gunfight at the wedding. My uncle was there. It's just fantastic Ukrainian affair. And then we went on honeymoon. Again, honeymoon comes from where this phrase comes from, honeymoon.
No, I don't.
Okay, so in pagan tradition, when a couple got married, they were supplied. They were sort of told they didn't have to work for a month, a month, 25 days, and they were given as much honey wine as they could drink. So that's mead, honey, and they basically you had to try and get her pregnant in the month, and you basically were just drunk and happy for a month, and that was the tradition in some pagan parts of England, the honeymoon.
Yeah, it doesn't sound too bad, huh?
Sounds okay, right? Just get shacked up with some pagan lad for a month. Have a good time. Stay your brain on honey wine.
But yeah, so you were like referencing those rituals, and that they had a power, even if they were not necessarily the rituals of your culture or your tradition. Did I get this right? That you still like felt the power of the ritual?
I mean, I think there's resonance if you and your people have done something for a long time. And this is, again, conservatives have an instinct towards tradition that progressives don't. And it's a sort of moral aesthetic instinct that they can't articulate well. Like most people support the monarchy in the UK. If you ask them why, they don't know. And logically, it's sort of insane, right? Logically, like feudal overlords by hereditary rulers, it's sort of mad, right? But then you see the ritual and you see the traditions. I felt sad when the Queen died because she'd always been the Queen my entire life. And it's not as I particularly liked her. I didn't dislike her, but I didn't particularly like her. I don't really, I'm a sort of Irish Republican in many ways. I don't really believe in monarchy. Much prefer to have a meritocracy and a democracy than a head of state being a royal. But part of me was kind of like, wow, this has been my whole life. And actually, it's not just my whole life because her family have been for generations. So there's power in that. And I think it's actually being progressive is actually very arrogant because you say, I know better than all my ancestors. Like my ancestors for 1,000 years have done, I don't know, monogamy, but I'm going to do polyamory. And you might be right. You might be the one who's thought times have changed. Times do change. You know, maybe we're at a point now where monogamy is out of date. I'm not going to say evil. I'm not going to tell you my belief here because I could go either way on it. And but it's pretty arrogant to say that they're all wrong and I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also you're cutting something off. Even if you are right, it's actually tragic if you're right because you're cutting off those traditions, that ancestry. Now, other people's traditions are still beautiful and wonderful. I've been in Jewish weddings, Ethiopian Orthodox weddings, all sorts of kind of different types of weddings over the years. But you always be kind of an outsider, and it doesn't have quite the same resonance. And I see kind of my more hippie friends trying to, where I live in a small town, they keep trying to create rituals. Like there's today's Beltane, is it? It's one of the pagan days. So they have a sort of song at dawn and it's new and it's really cool and God love them, but it doesn't touch me in the same way.
Yeah.
Because inventing ritual is tricky. It tends to be they more evolve.
Mm-hmm.
And we include little rituals in our trainings and, small things, giving people certificates or giving people swords or bowing a little bit, blowing out a candle. We have little rituals like that. And they're better. They're a lot better than nothing. But it's not the same as my people have done this for 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And on the other hand, it's like, I think in a way it's also necessary to create new rituals because they do have value, they do have power, and people might not necessarily resonate with the more Christian rituals. They also like lost their meaning in a way, right? Like there is very little ritual about Christmas. It's mostly about like spending money and
No, but
decorating
there's still
trees.
giving. There's still gift giving. Taking nature into the house with a tree. It's a German tradition that's spread around the world. I'd say rather than invent new ones, we can evolve them. We can add meaning. Let's take marriage, right? Like, even if you're not Christian, people really want to get married in the church, right? And people really want to be witnessed by their friends and family getting married. Even if you want to do it naked in the forest like the pagans did, but you still want to be witnessed. Like it was really like our wedding got moved from England to Ukraine because of the visa situation. And it was so important that some of my friends and family came. And my mother was too ill to make it. And my dad was really very ill, but he hid from me how ill he was. He was having like strokes on the plane. But I said, look, it's really important that one of my parents is there. And he just paused for a moment. And in that pause is the understanding of the importance of ritual and family. And when I'll make it. And in the end, my Scottish uncle managed to get him there, and they had to, they convinced the plane he wasn't having a stroke when he was. And, it's really like hardcore what was going on, but he understood the importance of being witnessed. And one of my best friends came, and two of my family came, my dad and my uncle, because it was last minute. You going to Ukraine is kind of a big deal, right? And so it's kind of last minute thing as well. And then we got married again in England, so it was even more like witnesses, because that witnessing is important. And yeah, we didn't have a Catholic priest, right? Because I'm not a big fan of the Catholic Church, but we still had a ceremony that was a bit like what you would do with a Catholic priest. And we didn't sing hymns, but we sang songs. And there's a flow to these things. People who are interfaith ministers, for example, I've known a few, they can design rituals, but based on what people do already, or based on if you've got a Jewish background or, like what you're into. And so it's not just we don't just pull them out of our ass if we make rituals. Like lighting a candle is always going to be a beautiful gesture. And I do that on my courses, but, I'm from a Catholic background, so of course I'm going to light a fucking candle.
Thanks for going into all kinds of directions with me. Because I really felt like when I prepared for this interview, I was a bit like, wow, you have so much stuff on the internet. Like if people want to see you do like 4-element stuff and, there's all kinds of things that people can check out. I will, of course, link this also in the show notes that people can check out your YouTube and everything. And I really thought like, no, I'm gonna just ask you the stuff that I'm personally interested in.
That's way juicier. Way juicier. Because normally I get asked, what is embodiment? How did you get into this work?
Yeah.
How was Ukraine? I get, I get asked the same few things. So it's
Yeah.
fun.
Is there like a favorite topic of yours at the moment, or anything that you enjoy talking about right now?
Well, I've already done that because whatever questions people ask me, I just talk about what I'm interested in, you see. And the sweet spot is if that happens to overlap your interests. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in the decline of the West and what that we're in the Weimar Republic right now, and what comes
Mhm.
after that ain't good. So I'm very interested in the decline of the West. Berlin absolutely reinforces that to me every time I'm there, as does East London and a few other places. So, and I'm interested in what's the embodied praxis that would save the West, like John Vervaeke. He's got some interest in a
Mhm.
similar topic.
Mhm.
Um, I am interested in this like ritual and embodied mysticism, so we sort of covered on that. That's definitely
Mhm.
something. Always interested in training teachers. I mean, I'm just a big teacher geek, basically. Like I'm
Mhm.
very, very particular and fussy, and have high standards when it comes to training teachers. So that's maybe something we
Mhm.
haven't talked about that I'm also very passionate about. Like, so we talked about
Yeah.
mysticism.
Yeah.
Here's the thing: I don't think you get to speak about embodied mysticism until you've got really, really clear about what is going on in embodiment from a non-mystical point of view. It's like
Ah.
it's kind of like a lot of people try and go straight into the mystical woo-woo, and it just ends up being very vague. And what I teach teachers or trainee coaches or whatever it is, and my mentees, whoever, is get really, really clear about what you're doing. Like we taught Christina, my German colleague, and I taught a session this morning on how to raise embodied awareness in people. And there's actually very concrete principles involved that are not woo-woo, they're not fluffy. You can extricate them from all these different practices, and you can say, right, this is a contrast principle, this is a deviation principle, this is an exaggeration principle. And there's only a few ways you can build embodied awareness. It's like, okay, you can point it, you can show it, you can tell it, and getting really, really clear on all these ways and the pros and cons. There's an advantage and a disadvantage for me telling you about your embodiment compared to you discovering it for yourself. And there's some in between stages. So that's the kind of thing that I go, let's be really vigorous about, really rigorous and vigorous. And then we can talk about mysticism and becoming a bird and, whatever, anal ayahuasca tripping or whatever. I don't know. So like that's the part that I really like with all my students. It's like 1 to 2 years of that, and
Yeah.
you saw that in Berlin, I think. Let's get Germanically clear about the
Mhm.
distinction,
Mhm.
and then let's write poetry on top of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it really takes time, because you like to when you start out with becoming an embodiment teacher or with an embodiment practice, that in the beginning you really um, you have to find the language for the sensations, for what you start to experience. And of course, if someone has a very, very clear language and very, very clear instructions, it makes things easier. But then in the end, it's still like in teaching, it's so much about implicit learning, like the intuition you gain with experience, that I think there's no shortcut to that in a way.
Yeah, I think there are shortcuts, but there's no immediacy to that.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I teach someone the 8 types of embodied intelligence, I break it down. Okay, now we're working on self-regulation, not social awareness or whatever. They will learn quicker. They will learn a lot quicker.
Hmm.
Equally, you can be, if you don't have clear distinctions, you'll feel something and someone say, hey, that's energy, and therefore it's this, and it's that. It's like, hang on a minute, it's just sensation. That's all we know. Yeah, maybe there's some kind of chi energy going on, and maybe that's a concept, or maybe you just felt tingling in your hands because of blood flow, right?
Hmm.
Like, let's get rigorous before we go down a dark alley that doesn't end anywhere. It's the dead end alley, because we don't have the clear distinctions. And then, as you say, you've got to put the hours in. Like I was talking to three very senior embodiment teachers yesterday. I have a little closed group for some very senior teachers. You have to have like 20 years practice to be in the group, and we discuss kind of different things. And one thing we discussed, I mean, that says something right there, right? The fact that we won't let anyone in with less than 20 years experience. It's not just because we're snobs. It's because there's certain things that only become apparent after 20 years, right?
Of course. Yeah.
There's people with 40 years experience in the group. And one thing we discussed is how long do we like to have students for? And this is a really interesting question. And we all sort of said kind of 3 to 5 years is good. And after 10 years, they should probably be becoming colleagues. 5 to 10, they start to become colleagues. So none of us said they become colleagues immediately. Like, skill isn't a democracy. Like, when I teach in Berlin, I'm like, I'm sorry, guys, we're not all equals. Some of you are experienced, some of you aren't, and I'm teaching today. So experience isn't democratic and skill isn't democratic. And it's like 3 to 5 years to get to the point where I might consider putting you in front of the room. And I was looking at Christina teaching today, and she's been studying with me for longer than that. And she's got talent, which is a thing, unfortunately, talent. You can't train everybody to be high level. It's a funny thing, like we see like sports talent or maths talent or music talent, but there is a thing, embodiment talent. I'm not that talented embodiment wise. She's much more talented than me. And I'm just determined and bloody minded and had some good teachers. But Christina's talented, and I was looking at her today just going, wow, this is as good, if not better, than I could teach this. And I'm taking notes, because what I do is I make the slides for my session while she teaches hers, and it reminds, because she remembers things. She's got a list because she's German, so she doesn't forget anything. and I was just like, wow, this is great. And she's, I think, about 7 or 8 years been with me. And after 10 years, if someone's not an equal like Christina is already, after a mere 7 or 8 years, then I think you're doing something wrong. Like, it's like, do you want a cult where you want followers for the rest of your life? Now, of course, I'm still learning, so it's not like someone could have studied with me 10 years ago and I'd be able to teach them something new now, But I think that's an interesting question. Like how long do you want students for on it? And it shows that no matter how good you are, no matter how talented the student is, no matter how hard they work, it's going to take them 2 or 3 years to get the basics. That's my mentorship program. Not advertising it, by the way, it's full up. Is like basically most people study with me for a year beforehand, and then they do 2 sort of intensive years. And by the end of that, then they're sort of being a bit more creative. They're, finding their own flavor.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one question that you raise in your book, right? Like this, would you like it if your students became as good or even better than you?
Yeah. I mean, Paul Linden's very proud that I am in some ways now better than him. And in other ways, he's still the master. Like, he's done a lot more body work than I have, hands-on stuff. He's still way better than me. So like that, I think, is our aspiration. Teachers kind of hanging on to authority. And we see this with the baby boomer generation generally, right? I mean, we have a presidential race between an 80-year-old and a 76-year-old or something. I mean, what the fuck? Young people can't buy houses in the UK because old people haven't got the good grace to die. It's this sort of ruling aged class. And at the same time, we don't really have respect for elders or any elders in our community. Because here's the thing about being progressive, right? As soon as you progress at a speed faster than 3 generations, you eliminate elders. Like, my granddad was like a little bit racist, but not so much that you kind of just wrote him off. Okay. Because it was like a little bit old fashioned because things are progressing. But as things have sped up, my grandchildren are going to think I'm an utterly abhorrent, awful human being, because they'll be like, look, granddad, everyone has sex with dogs. That's normal now. What are you against bestiality for? And it won't be that. It'll be something though, right? And whatever. What do you mean you eat meat? That's the worst thing ever, So as soon as you have progress at a rapid pace, you no longer need the wisdom of your elders and their values discussed you. And that's a problem. That's a problem, because youth has always needed elders. And in those times, you tend to get sort of child crusades, the child crusades from Europe, or Greta Thunberg, child crusaders, because they're pure and innocent and they're not corrupted by the awfulness of age.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's another topic. The whole, like, the missing elders and what to do about it.
Yeah, we could like slow down the pace of change a bit. Would be a good start. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
that's
that
true.
that that look like Berlin is unrecognizable in its demographic from 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. That's not to say they're worse people that are there, but it's very different.
Mm.
It's very different. And do we want to do that? Is there even to say, hey, there may be some things to be cautious of? That's particularly difficult to say in Germany, but it's not
Mm.
that easy to say in England. It's very easy to say in Ukraine or Poland. It's
Mm.
very easy to say in Japan. I mean, Japanese people love being Japanese. They're proud of being Japanese. They teach their
Mhm.
children to be proud of being Japanese. They go too far the other way. Actually, they deny all the atrocities the Japanese committed in war, for example.
Mhm.
But it's like if we're in denial of the beauty of our ancestors and our heritage, we're actually that's a form of self-hatred.
Yeah. Yeah. Big topic. Big topic.
Lots there. So I think we've talked about the main things. So mysticism, teaching. I'm talking about
Mhm.
normally people ask me about trauma, but we haven't gone there. But that's a topic that often people are often quite keen to
Yeah, you
learn about.
just gave an amazing interview on trauma. I listened to it, like on the trigonometry.
Yes, they were after. There are two conservative comedians. Comedians are generally getting more conservative now because fundamentalists never funny, and the left's got very fundamentalist. And they wanted a trauma teacher with a sense of humor, and I think I'm pretty much the only one that they had that they could find. So yeah, if people are interested in Ukraine and trauma, they should look up the Trigonometry podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's the sign of the times too, right? They're normal guys. You know, that podcast audience is just British blokes. It's not hippies.
Mm.
It's mostly men who are
Mm.
mostly working class.
Mm.
And the fact that 50,000 of them watched the YouTube video, I don't know how many listen to the podcast, like that's a lot of people that are interested in something,
Yeah,
you know? That's
yeah.
cool.
It's super
If I can
cool.
get through to those people, that's great. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
like my granddad didn't have access to that, you know?
yeah,
So it's cool.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. There's one more quote that I would like to bring
Mm.
that I read in your book. This, if you're a teacher yourself, or if you're a coach, or if you're working with people, you should know your top 3 personality flaws and
For
what you're doing
sure.
about them.
You get to ask me mine. Thanks, drugs, and rock and roll, baby. That's almost accurate, actually.
Yeah.
Power. Sex, drugs, and power. Yeah, you
Rock and roll
absolutely.
is for sure a personality.
So yeah, the rock and roll we could probably put in the provocation category. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we all have shadow, and people that without power, whether that be economic power, beauty power, organizational power, they always think that if they had power, they wouldn't abuse it. You know,
Mm.
if I was the dictator of the earth, I would be kind. No, you fucking wouldn't. You'd be like all the other dictators. You'd get corrupted and you'd be selfish. Um, yeah, there's the odd one like George Washington who give up power, you know, but generally we have to be careful of these things and this is where I think the sort of old fashioned Christian narrative of corruption is really helpful. You know,
Mhm.
I got kind of well known doing embodiment, and it does inflate your ego. Like when
Mhm.
someone says, "Are you Mark Walsh?" and they recognize you, you know, got recognized in Berlin in the street the other day, and I was like, "Fucking hell," you know, it's
Mhm.
kind of ego inflating,
For
and it's
sure.
hard not to be an idiot when that happens. Um, you know, unless you've had 200 beautiful Ukrainian women staring at you as their hero, don't tell me that that wouldn't corrupt you. Don't
Yeah.
tell me that you wouldn't be impacted by that. You
Yeah.
know, unless you've had £1 million in the bank. If you've had £1 million in the bank, then we'll talk about if you're really spiritually beyond money.
Mm.
All right.
Mm.
Until that point, you have no idea. You're a virgin talking about sex.
Yeah.
So, like, I feel like we are under-equipped as teachers for success. So, I'm very glad mine has come mostly gradually over kind of 20,
Mhm.
20 years, right? Rather than there's a few big elevations like the embodiment conference, right? But mostly it came bit by bit, and that is way better than being a football star or, you know, a pop star who suddenly gets famous the next day, suddenly gets money the next day, suddenly gets adoring fans the next day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and
yeah,
I think knowing your personality flaws really is a sign of maturity. Like it shows that you've done some work if you can name them and if you also know what you do about them.
yeah,
In a way.
practical things, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm just fucking horny as a guy. I've always have been. So one of my practical things is I just say out loud in public a lot, I don't sleep with my students. And I say that so often that if I did, people would be like, what the fuck? You know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, even to the point where if there's a really attractive student on one of my courses, I'll say to my colleague, damn, she's hot. And my colleague will go, yes, I agree. Keep away from her. Right.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
not. And like, because I know that keeps me honest.
Yeah.
Right. So there are practical things you need to do. I mean, ethically, we need a code. You need some, so it could be like ICF coaching ethics, right? It could be just we have our own company one with certain things we do and don't do. Everyone knows they're laid down. You need colleagues, so we have a community. Yeah. So, you know, me and Christina and Karin and the different teachers that I work with, we hold each other accountable. Yeah. I'll be like, hey, is that cool? Or, you know, one of my mentees was doing something a bit off the other day on the dance floor, and I just kind of pulled her up the next day and said, what were you doing there on the dance floor? What was that? You know, you're a married woman. What was that about? You know, it seemed like it crossed the line. And I didn't like shame her or anything, but I just came to her as a mentor and just gently challenged her on her behavior. Yeah. And the other thing we need is our own embodied sense, like to tune into our own embodied sense, to actually get a felt sense for, you know, should I speak up about this because no one else is, like back to our starting point, right? Like that's an embodied ethical compulsion in me. It's not good for business, you know, quite the opposite. So yeah, I think they're kind of three things, and I am far from perfect. So this is probably why I've thought about this more than most people. Yeah, you know, some people are just saints. I've got the line of good and evil running right through my fucking heart.
Yeah, but
So
you know,
who
like one
knows?
thing I learned in therapy is that the parent that you always thought was the good one is the more interesting to look at.
Is
So
it? Is
beware,
it?
like, yeah, yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna have to go think about that. What of them beat the shit out of you? Does that still count? But okay, so I'm going to have to go think about that. That's a good thing to think about. You're a great interviewer. I really wish your podcast well.
Thank you.
Can I tell people where to find me? Should they be interested in the definitely non-provocativeness? I think probably it was Facebook, but you might get insulted there. I mean, Instagram's pretty good these days. I do little reels on Instagram. I have a Ukrainian refugee friend who makes me do a reel every day, and she's really good at organizing it. So thank you, Mira. So our reels have got quite good. If people want to, Mark Walsh on Instagram. The books, 3 books, the podcast. If you like podcasts, which you must do if you're listening to this. We have an app with loads of free stuff on it. If you want some other embodiment teachers other than me, the app has access to a load of classes and a load of other recordings with other teachers. So if you thought, I love embodiment, but I don't like this guy, then get the app and you'll be out. Good.
Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful.
Total pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. And as always, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and your questions, remarks, concerns, and yeah, especially if there are parts that you disagree with strongly. I'd be happy if you reached out and we can start an exchange and be in touch. And yeah, I wish you a good balance between self-discipline and authentic expression. And hopefully see you back in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.